Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Whitfield said the moment Margaret Walsh walked into Cedar Creek Medical on a Tuesday in March, her grey hair pinned back in a bun so tight it pulled at her temples, her scrubs deliberately plain, her shoes scuffed from a life lived before this one. She didn't correct him. She didn't need to. The words were meant to land like a dismissal, and they did, sliding off her the way rain slides off treated canvas. He turned back to his surgical charts without waiting for a response, his tailored lab coat catching the fluorescent light like a statement of rank, and Margaret simply moved past him toward the night shift assignment board, where her name appeared in small grey text beneath 3 other nurses' names, all of them younger, all of them ambitious in ways that showed. The lights above hummed their endless mechanical drone, and she could smell the particular blend of antiseptic and stale coffee that defines every hospital at 10 p.m., that moment when the day shift ghosts out and the night shift settles in like people moving into someone else's house. Cedar Creek Medical sprawled across 4 blocks of Savannah, all red brick and modern additions that never quite matched the original structure, a place where the fluorescent corridors seemed to stretch longer after dark and the stainless steel equipment reflected faces that looked older than they probably were. The surgical wing occupied the 3rd floor, and that was Whitfield's kingdom. He'd built it over 15 years through board connections that Margaret could read in the way donors' names appeared on plaques in the hallway, through relationships with pharmaceutical representatives who sent bottles of wine to his office, through a reputation that had calcified into institutional power. He moved through the corridors like someone who owned them, his voice carrying the particular timbre of men accustomed to obedience, and when he spoke to the surgical staff, people moved. When he ignored them, they understood that the ignoring was intentional, a form of communication more brutal than criticism. Margaret's mission handler had been explicit in the briefing 3 weeks earlier, the one that happened in a parked Suburban with Maryland plates outside a rest stop near the North Carolina border. Colonel James Mercer, retired from JSOC but still connected to things that didn't appear on organizational charts, had handed her a folder containing Cedar Creek Medical's personnel structure, floor plans, and a single photograph of a patient file she was never supposed to see except from a distance. "You're a night shift nurse," Mercer had said. "That's all you are. That's all you can be." Whitfield runs the surgical wing, and his wing has been selected for a classified patient recovery program, veterans from theater with specific medical situations we need monitored. The program is legitimate. The recovery is real. But there are questions about whether protocols are being followed correctly, whether every patient is receiving appropriate care. He'd paused, letting the implications settle like sediment. You're there as a nurse, nothing else. If your cover breaks, we pull you, and the entire operation collapses. 17 service members currently in post-recovery phases depend on maintaining the integrity of that program. Margaret had simply nodded. She'd understood the stakes before he explained them. 6 months into the assignment, nobody at Cedar Creek Medical suspected anything. The night shift was where experienced nurses went to disappear, where competence was assumed to be sufficient and ambition wasn't required. Margaret had cultivated that invisibility with the precision of someone who understood camouflage as a survival tool. She arrived at 10:06 p.m., changed into her scrubs in the locker room while other staff moved around her without really seeing her, and took report on the 12 patients in the surgical recovery ward. She knew which monitors to prioritize, which alarm threshold signaled actual danger versus sensor drift, which medications required verification against which lab values. She moved through the ward with an economy of motion that suggested long practice, catching details that other nurses missed, a patient's slightly elevated temperature that would become sepsis if untreated by morning, a medication interaction that hadn't been flagged in the computerized order entry system, a dressing that needed changing before the patient attempted to roll over in sleep. The other nurses noticed eventually that nothing went wrong on her shifts. Patients healed. Complications were caught before they escalated. Medications were verified twice instead of once, against protocols that exceeded what was actually required. But they didn't know why, and they didn't ask. That was the nature of night shift work. You kept your head down, you did your job, and you didn't ask questions about why Janet from the day shift always seemed to be running behind. The charge nurse, a woman named Diane who'd been at Cedar Creek for 8 years, had actually said during Margaret's first week, "You're going to do fine here. You don't talk much, which is good. We don't have time for talking." High praise in the context of night shift nursing, which was its own kind of kingdom, smaller and quieter than the day shift, but no less demanding. Margaret's locker sat in the northwest corner of the staff room, the one closest to the exit, a position she'd claimed on the first day by arriving early and taking it before anyone else could. Inside, she kept her extra pair of scrubs, a small mirror, her badge, and a photograph of Ethan at age 8, his front teeth missing and his grin enormous against a backdrop of the Outer Banks. Behind those items, in a space between the locker's interior wall and the external casing, she kept one more thing, a military challenge coin, tarnished and worn dark, the kind of object that could be nothing in the eyes of someone who didn't know what it meant, and everything to someone who did. The coin had come from the 160th SAW Night Stalkers, the unit she'd served with 23 years earlier, and it bore the weight of a decade spent in places that didn't appear on commercial maps, doing work that had no official designation. She turned it over every night before her shift began, holding it for exactly 6 seconds, the ritual so private and so practiced that even she barely noticed she was doing it anymore. The coin was muscle memory made physical, a reminder of why she was really at Cedar Creek, a talisman that meant, stay focused, stay sharp, someone is counting on you. The fluorescent lights buzzed their constant frequency, the sound so omnipresent that Margaret had stopped hearing it consciously sometime in week 2, but her nervous system still registered it as ambient danger, the way people who've lived in combat zones register certain kinds of silence. On her third night of every week, she was assigned to monitor a specific recovery room on the east side of the surgical wing, the one with the private entrance and the sealed medical records. The patient population there rotated, but the consistency was absolute: young military personnel, all male, all with injuries that corresponded to theater deployments, all with chart notations in Colonel Mercer's voice describing specialized recovery protocol requiring advanced nursing oversight. She never looked at their names without authorization. She never asked about their units. She did notice, though, that they tended to recognize things in her that younger nurses didn't: the way she handled a suture kit, the efficiency of her movements, the particular manner in which she approached wound care with the economy of someone who'd done it in conditions far less sterile than a hospital recovery room. Some of them watched her the way soldiers watch other soldiers, with the kind of recognition that needs no explanation. And Margaret gave them nothing but competent clinical care, her face neutral, her hand steady, her presence so carefully calibrated that it existed at the edge of perception. The first time Dr. Whitfield made his authority felt, it was a Tuesday evening at the shift change, the moment when day and night nurses overlapped in that tense negotiation of information transfer. He was standing in the hallway outside the trauma bay, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression conveying the particular irritation of a man accustomed to immediate accommodation. He saw Margaret pushing the medication cart toward the recovery ward, and his eyes tracked her with something between disinterest and contempt. "You're the night shift floater, aren't you?" he said, not quite a question. Margaret. She didn't add anything. Didn't offer a title or a credential. Just the name. "Well, Margaret," he continued, turning away but still speaking loud enough for the other staff to hear, "let's make sure we maintain standards around here. This isn't a retirement home. I see people who haven't kept up with their training, people who are here just to collect a paycheck. I won't tolerate that. Cedar Creek Medical maintains the highest level of surgical excellence, and that means every person in this wing meets my expectations." He paused, letting the implication settle. "I assume you're capable of that level of performance." Margaret simply inclined her head, the smallest acknowledgement, and continued moving the medication cart forward, her hand steady on the handle, her breathing unchanged. But in the pocket of her scrubs, her fingers found the challenge coin, turning it once, twice, the metal warming against her palm. 3 months into Cedar Creek Medical, Margaret had learned the precise angle at which to stand in the hospital cafeteria so that she remained visible but unremarkable, the way institutional lighting had a habit of sliding past people who didn't demand attention. She moved through the lunch line with her tray, selecting a salad and water, the kind of meal that announced nothing about her and provoked no questions. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric monotone above the white tile floor, and the smell of institutional gravy hung thick in the air like a fog nobody challenged. The cafeteria was crowded at 12:19 p.m., surgeons in their dark blue scrubs mixing with nurses in various shades of green, the hierarchy visible in the way bodies angled toward each other. Margaret chose a table near the corner, the kind where a woman her age could disappear into the background noise. She had almost reached it when Dr. Whitfield entered from the opposite side of the room, flanked by two board members in tailored suits, their shoes clicking against the tile with the confidence of men who owned property that owned other people. He saw her immediately. Not the seeing that meant recognition, but the seeing that meant target acquisition. Whitfield's voice cut across the cafeteria with the casual precision of a knife finding a gap between ribs. "Hey, Margaret!" He wasn't smiling. The smile came after the greeting, the kind of smile that announced he was about to do something that would entertain the room. "I've got $10 that says you last exactly one more week before you quit." The room didn't go silent. The room didn't need to go silent for everyone to hear him. Conversations continued around them with the mechanical steadiness of background noise, but Margaret could feel the shift in atmospheric pressure, the way a predator senses a sudden movement in tall grass. She kept walking toward her table without breaking stride. "No?" Whitfield's voice rose slightly, the sound of a man unused to being ignored. He stepped sideways, moving into her direct path with the kind of deliberate slowness that announced he could do this whenever he wanted. "Not interested in a bet? I think the night shift's wearing you down. You're moving slower than usual, and you were already pretty slow." Margaret stopped 3 feet away from him. She looked at him for exactly 1 second, long enough for him to register that she was looking, not long enough for him to claim she'd engaged in a confrontation. Then she shifted her path with the kind of lateral step that suggested she was navigating around furniture, not around a man, and continued toward her table. He followed. The tray sat on the edge of a lunch table occupied by 4 nurses from the day shift. Whitfield was suddenly beside her, his presence occupying the space like something heavier than human biology should allow. His hand moved, a motion so quick and casual it almost looked accidental, and his wrist caught the edge of her tray as she set it down. Salad, water, napkin, and plastic fork hit the white floor with the sound of breaking dishware, a sound that carried through the cafeteria like a gunshot in a canyon. The room did go silent then. Margaret stood motionless for exactly 2 seconds while her lunch scattered across the tile in a pattern that looked random but actually mapped the trajectory of her fallen tray. The iceberg lettuce pieces looked like tiny pale stones. The water pooled into something that caught the overhead light and threw it back. Whitfield's eyes were bright with the satisfaction of a man who had successfully manufactured a public moment. He picked up a patient chart from the table beside them, someone's half-finished note from the morning rounds, and tossed it onto the floor near her feet with a velocity that was excessive for the distance traveled. The chart landed sideways, papers sliding slightly, and when he spoke, his voice had the texture of honey that had learned to bite. "Pick that up, sweetheart. You're better at floor work than operating with actual patients anyway." The silence held for 3 more seconds. The kind of silence that belongs to people who understand they are watching someone being dismantled. The 2 board members with Whitfield exchanged a glance, not approval exactly, but the kind of look that suggested they were making note of the room's temperature, the way the staff deferred to him, the absolute absence of challenge. Margaret bent down. Her knees moved with the fluidity of someone who had performed this motion 1,000 times under worse conditions. Her hands, calloused across the palms in a way that didn't quite match her title of night shift nurse, collected the scattered papers with methodical precision. The salad pieces, the napkin, the plastic fork, the water that had already stopped dripping. She gathered them into a compact pile, her breathing unchanged, her jaw working exactly once as if she were chewing something bitter and had decided to swallow it whole. When she straightened, the chart was in her hands, the scattered meal in a compact ball. She turned to the trash receptacle 12 feet away and disposed of everything with the kind of careful placement that suggested she was dealing with hazardous material. Then she walked to her station for the afternoon rounds. The nurses at the lunch table didn't look at her as she passed. The 2 board members returned their attention to Whitfield, who was already describing some technical achievement from the previous week's surgical roster. By 12:58 p.m., the cafeteria had resumed its mechanical conversation, and Margaret had disappeared into the background noise where she had learned, long ago, to be most dangerous. But something had changed in her pocket. Her fingers found the challenge coin during the first break, 14:22, a gap in the afternoon flow when the ER held its breath between traumas. The coin was tarnished silver, no larger than a $50, with an insignia that had worn down over years of being turned in calloused hands. She held it for 12 seconds in the darkness of the supply closet where she stood, her thumb running across the raised edge, the metal warm from her body temperature. The coin had been through Baghdad. It had been in her pocket during 3 tours, 2 of which Whitfield would never spend anywhere more dangerous than a golf course with board members who owed him favors. She put the coin away and returned to the evening rounds. The appendectomy admit arrived at 1933, 22 years old, name tattooed on his forearm in black lettering, eyes that held the specific exhaustion of someone who had looked at things that didn't have names. He was Army Ranger, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines attached. The chart said his name was Jackson. It didn't say he had 3 Baghdad deployments, but Margaret could read it in the way his hands moved, hyper-aware of the 4 line in his arm, the constant low-level scanning of exits. She prepared the pre-op suture kit with the kind of methodical precision that belonged to someone who had assembled similar kits under conditions where the lighting was worse and the available seconds were fewer. Her hands moved in patterns that muscle memory could complete in darkness. The knots were specific, the kind taught in combat medic training, the kind that held under extreme conditions. Jackson watched her work. When she reached for the hemostats, his eyes focused on the exact angle of her hands as they arranged the instruments in surgical order. His voice was soft, barely above the pre-op sedation starting to blur his edges. "You tie a combat medic's knot." It wasn't a question. Margaret didn't pause. Her hands continued their work. She was aware of the other nurses in the pre-op area, the anesthesiologist reviewing his charts, the machinery beginning its startup sequence for the emergency procedure. She looked at Jackson for exactly half a second, long enough for him to see her eyes track to his, and then she gave the smallest shake of her head, so small it might have been a breathing adjustment, might have been a reflection of the overhead light in the movement of her hair. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did that specific thing they do when a soldier recognizes that he has just been given an order. She returned her attention to the suture kit, her movements unchanged, her composure absolute. The supply cart wheel squeaked faintly as she repositioned it. The machines around Jackson beeped their various readiness signals. The fluorescent lights continued their electric hum. In 34 minutes, he would be on an operating table while Whitfield, a surgeon with a 97% complication rate he had buried in confidential reviews, a man who had learned to weaponize the trust that credentials manufactured, would cut into his abdomen with the same careless confidence he had used to knock her tray onto a cafeteria floor. The real nightmare was about to begin. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as Margaret moved through the ICU at 2:43 in the morning, checking Jackson's post-op vitals like she had 1,000 times before. His chart looked routine. Recovery trajectory normal. Then she saw his face. The color was wrong. Ashen. A fine sheen of sweat across his forehead despite the room temperature sitting at 68 degrees. His breathing had shifted, shallow, rapid, almost panicked. She placed her hand on his chest and felt what her body already knew before her mind could catch up, the telltale muffled heart sound beneath the sternum. Pulsus paradoxus. The blood pressure dropping with each breath he took. Cardiac tamponade. The appendectomy incision was clean, but something had been missed. Internal bleeding. Blood accumulating in the pericardial sac, squeezing his heart like a fist that wouldn't relax. He had maybe 4 minutes before his blood pressure crashed entirely. Margaret's entire body went still. Not frozen. Still. The way a hunter goes still when the prey appears in the clearing. Her hand remained on his chest for exactly 1 second, then she moved. Not rushed. Purposeful. Economical. Every motion exactly where it needed to be. "I need a pericardiocentesis kit. Now." Her voice had dropped 3 octaves. Not a request. A command delivered in the tone of someone who had performed emergency procedures in field hospitals where the only ceiling was sky and the only anesthesia was adrenaline and prayer. The night nurse, Amy, 26 years old, good instincts, no combat experience, froze. I'll call Dr. Whitfield. No time. Get the kit. Margaret's hands were already moving, finding the landmarks on Jackson's ribs. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She'd done this in Fallujah with sand in her teeth and mortar fire walking closer with each shell. She could do this in a climate-controlled ICU at Cedar Creek Medical in her sleep. What are you doing? Amy's voice climbed an octave. Margaret, you can't. Friction rub. Listen. Margaret pulled the stethoscope from around her neck and placed it against Jackson's chest, positioning it for Amy to hear. The sound was there, unmistakable. The pericardial friction rub that meant blood was filling the sac around his heart, that Jackson had maybe 3 minutes now instead of 4. Amy ran for the kit. Smart girl. She understood anatomy. She understood that sometimes the chain of command meant nothing when a human being was dying in front of you. Margaret's hands were already gloved. Surgical precision. The 14-gauge needle felt familiar in her grip, the same weight, the same balance as the one she'd used in the desert. She cleansed the insertion point with antiseptic that smelled like hospitals in 2 countries and looked like every hospital in none. The sharp chemical bite of chlorhexidine. The cold shock of the needle finding its angle. Jackson's eyes opened. Recognition flashed there, just for a moment. He saw her hands. He saw the way her shoulders had shifted. He knew. Don't move, she said quietly. Stay absolutely still. The needle went in. The world held its breath. Margaret's breathing stayed controlled, steady, like she was pulling a trigger in the quiet before dawn, like every life she'd ever held had been preparing her for exactly this moment at 2:43 in the morning in Savannah, Georgia. There. The give. The needle had pierced through the pericardium. She could feel it in her fingertips. She'd trained her hands through 3 combat tours and they remembered every field hospital, every emergency, every second when speed meant the difference between a name on a memorial wall and a person walking out of the hospital on their own. The syringe filled. Dark blood. 40 milliliters. Then 50. The pressure release immediate. Palpable. Jackson's oxygen saturation was holding at 68. Margaret's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She watched the monitor numbers like they were coordinates of her own heartbeat. Pressure, she asked. Amy was checking. 72/40. Keep watching. The needle was still in place. Margaret's steady hands began the slow withdrawal while simultaneously watching the monitor. 68. 72. 75. The blood was draining. The pressure around his heart was releasing. His body began to remember how to work like a heart should work. 75. 78. 82. 85. The numbers climbed like a ladder she was building one rung at a time. Her eyes never left the screen. Her hands never wavered. 88. 90. 92. Stable. The syringe held 120 milliliters of dark blood. That was the killing amount. That was the volume that would have put Jackson in the ground by dawn if Margaret had been in the cafeteria making small talk instead of here, watching, waiting, ready. She withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd inserted it. The 4 line was already established. She secured it with practiced efficiency, her movements carrying the muscle memory of someone who had done this in sandstorm-blown field hospitals where the lighting was terrible and the clock was always running out. The entire procedure took 4 minutes and 16 seconds. Jackson's oxygen sat 92%. His blood pressure 104/62. His heart rate coming down from the tachycardia of a human being who'd just had his circulatory system collapse and been pulled back from the edge. Good work, Margaret said to Amy, and her voice was already shifting back, lowering itself, making itself smaller. His surgeon needs to know about this. There's bleeding we missed in the initial closure. Amy nodded, still stunned, still processing what she'd just watched. Still understanding on some level that what she'd witnessed wasn't just good nursing. It was something else. Something more. Something that didn't fit inside the box of night shift nurse from the day shift who keeps to herself. That was when the doors to the ICU opened. Dr. Whitfield stood in the threshold at 2:58 in the morning, still wearing yesterday's cologne and today's arrogance, flanked by 2 board members he'd called at midnight. His eyes moved from Margaret to the empty pericardiocentesis kit on the tray to Jackson's now stable monitors. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Whitfield's face shifted through 4 emotions in sequence: confusion, then understanding, then something darker. Anger, yes, but not the hot kind. The cold kind. The kind that came from watching his authority undermined. From watching someone he dismissed as at past her prime save a life using a procedure that only someone with serious medical training would know how to execute perfectly. What was performed here? His voice was glass-smooth and dangerous. Emergency pericardiocentesis, Margaret said. Cardiac tamponade secondary to undiagnosed bleeding in the pericardial sac. Without authorization. Without time for authorization. Margaret's hands were already peeling off the gloves. Slow. Deliberate. Not nervous. Not trying to hide anything. Simply documenting the end of a procedure. His pressure dropped to 72/40. Blood saturation falling. There are protocols. Protocols for when there's time. Margaret disposed of the gloves in the biohazard container. This wasn't that. Whitfield's jaw tightened. He stepped closer to Jackson's bedside, examining the monitors as if he could will them to show something different. As if the numbers themselves might be lying. The oxygen sat steady at 92. The blood pressure holding. The heart rhythm regular and strong on the screen. One of the board members cleared his throat. Dr. Whitfield, the patient does appear to be stable. She had no authority to perform that procedure. Whitfield's voice hadn't changed pitch, but something had shifted underneath it. Something predatory. Something that understood that what Margaret had just done was more than a medical intervention. It was a challenge to the hierarchy itself. It was a proof that there were moments when the chain of command meant nothing compared to the human body's fundamental right to keep living. Margaret turned from Jackson's bedside and looked directly at Dr. Whitfield. Her eyes were steady. Her posture unchanged. Her composure complete and absolute. He was dying, she said. I'm a nurse. That's what we do. The words were simple. The delivery was steel-wrapped in softness, and Whitfield felt it the way a person feels cold air on their skin. He felt the implication. He felt the answer hiding underneath her compliance. He felt the moment slip away from his control. I want a full report from administration, Whitfield said. And I'm opening a formal investigation into this incident. He left the ICU at 2:59 in the morning, his board members following like satellites, already making phone calls, already beginning the machinery of institutional power. Already setting the wheels in motion that would change everything. Margaret checked Jackson's monitors one more time. The numbers were perfect. The man was alive because she'd recognized the signs and moved faster than protocol allowed, faster than hierarchy permitted, faster than the bureaucracy of hospitals could accommodate. She didn't know yet that Whitfield would spend the next 18 hours on the phone with the state nursing board. That he would call her references demanding background details she couldn't provide without breaking her cover. That he would fabricate 6 policy violations and submit them to the hospital administration with the confidence of a man who'd spent 15 years learning exactly which people owed him favors and exactly how to call those debts in. She didn't know yet that her mission handler would call at 3 in the morning and deliver words that tasted like ash: if your cover breaks, we pull you. Everything collapses. She only knew that Jackson was alive. That his monitor showed a sinus rhythm. That sometimes you had to choose between following the rules and saving a life, and that choice had a cost she was about to learn. Whitfield stood in the doorway of the ICU, his face a portrait of calculated concern as he addressed the 2 board members he'd summoned at midnight. A reckless procedure, he said, his voice carrying the wounded tone of a man protecting institutional integrity. Performed without attending authorization. She took it upon herself to intervene in a case that required my approval, and frankly, her credentials don't qualify her for that level of decision-making. The board members exchanged glances. One of them, a woman in a charcoal suit who'd arrived from her home in 15 minutes, made a note on her tablet. Whitfield continued, his words falling like precision strikes. I'm concerned about what this means for our protocols. For our liability. For patient safety. He paused, letting the weight of institutional fear settle over them. I had no choice but to call you both immediately. By 6:44 a.m., before Margaret had even clocked out from her shift, Whitfield's network was already moving. His first call went to the Tennessee Board of Nursing, a contact he'd cultivated for exactly this kind of situation, a voice that carried weight when he needed it to. I'm flagging a serious incident, he told the board representative, his tone urgent but controlled. Unauthorized medical intervention. Patient at risk. I need a formal investigation opened, and I need it documented today. He ended the call and immediately began typing emails to Margaret's previous references from her nursing background, each message requesting detailed background information, any performance concerns, any red flags he should know about. The emails were polite on the surface, toxic underneath, the kind of institutional poison that spread slowly but thoroughly. Within the hour, he'd submitted a formal investigation request to Cedar Creek's compliance department, citing 6 policy violations, performing a procedure outside her scope of practice, failing to notify attending physician before intervention, unauthorized use of critical care medications, operating without proper credentials verification, breach of chain of command, and gross negligence endangering patient safety. Every single violation was fabricated. Every single one was airtight from a paperwork perspective. Margaret's phone buzzed at 7:13 a.m. as she sat in the break room, still in her scrubs, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee she couldn't bring herself to drink. The call came from a number she'd memorized but never saved in her phone. Her mission handler. She stepped outside into the humid Savannah morning and answered without saying hello. You deviated, the handler said. No preamble. No acknowledgement of the save. The Ranger was not part of the operation. He was crashing, Margaret said quietly. Cardiac tamponade. For minutes to arrest. I'm aware. You made the right call medically. That's not the issue. A pause. The sound of papers shuffling. The issue is your cover. You're there as a nurse, nothing else. The mission requires invisibility. You just made yourself visible to the entire surgical wing. Margaret closed her eyes. She already knew what was coming. Whitfield is using it, the handler continued. He's activated his network. State board, references, formal investigation. We're monitoring the chatter now. If your cover breaks, if anyone traces your background, if this reaches federal attention before we can control it, we pull you and the entire operation collapses. Understood. Understood. The Ranger will be protected. We have assets in place for his recovery. But you need to be prepared for the fallout. Cedar Creek is going to move fast. Legal will be involved. This escalates from here. The line went dead. Margaret stood in the parking lot for another 20 minutes, her phone heavy in her hand. The challenge coin in her scrub pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She'd carried it through 3 tours, through Fallujah, through Kandahar, through the day the IED took her leg and put shrapnel in her shoulder and ended her active service. The coin was her anchor, the thing that reminded her who she really was underneath the grey hair and the plain scrubs and the deferential posture. But right now it felt like evidence. Like a liability. The termination letter was waiting for her when she arrived at Cedar Creek's administrative office at 8:22 a.m. 2 pages, official letterhead, her name printed in the formal way that made it feel like someone else's career being ended. Violation of institutional protocol. Unauthorized medical intervention. Failure to follow chain of command. Effective immediately. She read it 3 times without feeling anything, her face a study in absolute composure, her breathing steady and controlled. The decision is final, the HR director said, not meeting her eyes. Security will escort you to your locker. You'll have 20 minutes to collect your personal items. Margaret nodded once. Understood. She drove to the parking garage in a daze, not the daze of shock, but the practiced dissociation of someone who'd learned long ago how to compartmentalize crisis. The garage was dim even in morning, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a sickly yellow-white. She found her spot on the third level, parked the car, and gripped the steering wheel with both hands. Her forehead came down against the top of the wheel. The key was still in the ignition. She couldn't turn it. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. From restraint. From rage locked down so deep it manifested as physical tremor. 6 months. 6 months of invisible work, of monitoring Jackson's recovery, of documenting Whitfield's pattern of abuse and institutional corruption, of laying groundwork for the larger operation that was supposed to unfold over the next year. Gone. Burned. The Pentagon would spin down the mission. The team in Baghdad who'd been expecting her intelligence would have to reroute resources. The entire investigation into Cedar Creek's veteran care protocols would be shelved. And Jackson, her patient, her responsibility, her brother in service, would lose the oversight that had kept him safe. Her reflection stared back at her in the rearview mirror. A grey-haired nurse with tired eyes. A nobody. A woman past her prime who'd overstepped, who'd let emotion override protocol, who'd chosen to save a life instead of protecting a mission. The termination letter sat on the passenger seat, official and final. In the parking garage harsh light, 6 months of work looked exactly like what it was, a failure. She reached for the challenge coin in her pocket. Pulled it out. Held it in her palm. The metal was cold, worn smooth by thousands of hours in her hands. On one side was the crest of her unit. On the other, the inscription, "Pain is information." Someone had given this to her in 2011 in a TOC in Kandahar after she'd set a femur fracture with a field-expedient splint and kept the casualty stabilized for 8 hours through a sandstorm while waiting for medevac. A captain, name she couldn't quite remember anymore, had pressed it into her hands and said the same thing, "That's what separates us from them. We learn from it. We don't break from it." She sat in the darkness of her car, engine cold, forehead back against the steering wheel, the coin digging into her palm, and for the first time in 6 months she felt something like doubt. Maybe Whitfield was right. Maybe she was past her prime. Maybe she should have waited for authorization. Maybe the mission was more important than one life. Maybe. And then she heard it. Distant at first, then unmistakable. The low rhythmic thump of rotors, moving fast, coming closer. Not one helicopter. Multiple. The sound echoed through the parking garage, grew louder, filled the entire structure with the percussion of heavy-lift birds coming in hot. Black hawks, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that meant military, that meant someone had activated something massive, that meant. She lifted her head. The coin was still in her hand. And the rotor wash was shaking the garage. She was still sitting in the car when Ethan's text came through at 6:02 a.m. "Mom, where are you? I found something." 20 minutes later, he stood in her apartment doorway breathing hard, holding a shadow box she'd kept hidden in the storage unit for 8 years. Margaret's hand moved toward him automatically, a gesture to put it down, but Ethan was already talking. "Mom, they need to see these." Inside the frame, mounted on black velvet, were 3 purple hearts arranged in descending order. Beneath them, a navy cross. To the right, a ribbon bar so dense with color it looked like compressed fire, combat action ribbons, a meritorious service medal, an army commendation medal with Valor device. The glass caught the morning light and threw it back at her like a mirror she didn't want to look into. "Ethan, put it away." "No." He was 16 and furious and holding her entire past in both hands. "They're firing you. They don't know who you are. They think you're just." "I'm going back to the hospital." The word surprised both of them. Margaret hadn't known she was going to say them until they were already out, hanging in the apartment air like a held breath. Ethan drove. She sat in the passenger seat with the shadow box across her lap, feeling the weight of it, not the physical weight, but the gravity of 8 years of silence about to collapse. The hospital appeared through the rain like a monument to a life she'd tried to bury. Ethan pulled into the underground garage and turned to her. "You're not going in alone." He walked ahead of her into the conference room on the 3rd floor where the board was still deliberating, still arguing about whether her unauthorized procedure constituted gross negligence or heroic intervention. The door swung open and Ethan stepped inside, moving toward the polished mahogany table with the kind of purpose that made every administrator look up from their laptops. He set the shadow box down in the center of the table. "That's my mother," he said. "Before she was your nurse." Dr. Whitfield's face went the color of old concrete. The board chairman's hand froze above his coffee cup. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then the ICU doors at the end of the hallway opened and Jackson wheeled himself through them, still in his surgical gown, still tethered to a rolling stand that clicked and rattled with each rotation of his wheels. He defied direct orders to come down. His face was pale but his eyes were locked on Margaret with the clarity of recognition. "Nightingale 6, he said. His voice carried the rasp of someone still intubated 12 hours ago. "That's her call sign." The board chairman stood. Who is this?" "Army Ranger, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. And she just kept me alive." Then the elevator at the corridor's far end opened and the security guard who worked nights, the man Margaret had nodded to 100 times in passing, never exchanging words, came to attention so precise it seemed to vibrate through the room's very architecture. "Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh," he said, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony. "I served under you in Fallujah. 2006, Jolan District. You pulled me and 2 others out of a burning Humvee." The room went so quiet you could hear the rain hammering the windows outside, a sound like distant applause no one had invited. The conference room door opened again and a man in a charcoal suit entered, not walking, gliding, with the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding entire operations. The 2-star general who'd been brought in to oversee the veteran patient recovery program. He was carrying a classified file with a red stripe across its cover. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "Bronze Star," he read aloud, his voice steady but strained. The board members exchanged glances, confused. "Silver Star," he continued. Whitfield's jaw had gone slack. 2 Purple Hearts. One received for fragmentation wounds sustained during an IED strike, Kandahar Province, 2009. The second for, he paused, and when he looked up at Margaret his eyes were wet. For shrapnel wounds sustained while shielding 2 wounded soldiers during a direct-fire engagement in Baghdad, 2010. Medically retired, disability rating 60%. "And a Navy Cross," Jackson said quietly from his wheelchair. Which she never told anyone about because she was too busy training the next generation of combat medics. The general closed the file. 3 tours as a special operations medic. For separate citations for Valor. She architected the field trauma protocols that are now standard across every combat theater. She saved an estimated 4,847 lives. He set the file on the table next to the shadow box. "And you people fired her." 10 seconds of silence. Pure silence. The kind that only happens when an entire system recognizes it has made a catastrophic error. Whitfield's mouth opened. Nothing came out. What happened next happened fast. Within 72 hours, the state board's investigation into Margaret's termination had pivoted. They'd found the fabricated complaints. But they'd also found everything else, the pattern of procedure overbilling dating back 7 years, the 3 patient deaths Whitfield had blamed on nursing staff despite his own surgical notes revealing preventable complications caused by his cutting corners to save operative time. The hospital's legal team had already contacted federal investigators. 2 years later, Margaret was walking through a strip mall parking lot in the northwest corner of Savannah when she saw him. A folding table with a banner that read Whitfield Insurance Services. A man behind it in a short-sleeved shirt, name tag reading Steve, his face weathered and small. He was arranging pamphlets and trying not to make eye contact with anyone passing. She didn't slow down. Didn't acknowledge him. Just felt the weight of her restored credentials in her bag, the Master Chief's insignia, the official reactivation papers, the clearance that had been quietly reinstated at the Pentagon level. And in her jacket pocket, an invitation printed on heavy cardstock, presidential seal embossed at the top. The invitation requested her presence in 2 days. The Navy and Marine Corps medal ceremony was being held at Walter Reed. 23 years of classified service. 4,000 lives saved in the dark. The shrapnel still in her left shoulder blade, a souvenir from Baghdad that she'd never bothered to have removed because pain was information and she needed to remember. She stood in her apartment the morning before the ceremony, in uniform for the first time in 8 years, and Ethan walked up and hugged her so hard she couldn't breathe. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that comes from holding a gun to someone's head and choosing not to pull the trigger. From watching someone destroy themselves through greed and arrogance while you stayed silent. From understanding that the real power was never in the violence. It was in the choice to heal instead. Scars tell stories. This one had taken a decade to tell. The hospital installed a new trauma wing named after Jackson, the ranger who'd wheeled himself down a hallway in defiance of orders. They expanded the veteran patient recovery program. Margaret was offered the position of chief of trauma surgery and turned it down. She was still working at Cedar Creek, still on night shift, still in scrubs, still checking vitals at 3 a.m. for patients who'd never know who was actually standing at their bedside. A young intern asked her once why she didn't take the promotion. Why she stayed on the floor instead of moving to administration. Margaret checked the monitor, adjusted the flow rate, made a note on the chart. "My fight is here," she said. "Always has been. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, like and subscribe. What would you have done if you were Margaret? Let Whitfield bury you, or let the truth come out? Drop that in the comments.